When Barron Trump walked into the debate hall, no one expected the quietest Trump to steal the show. But what happened next left the entire room in stunned silence. It started as a routine discussion at an elite private school. One of those lively debates where students engage in back-and-forth arguments on politics, economics, and social issues. The topic of the day? Free speech on college campuses. And as always, the room was filled with strong opinions. A liberal student, known for his outspoken views, was quick to jump in. He passionately argued that certain speech should be restricted if it could be deemed offensive or harmful. He brought up examples of protests, controversial speakers, and the so-called misinformation crisis. His voice carried confidence, and he seemed certain that he had the upper hand. Many in the audience nodded in agreement. It was the kind of argument that had been winning debates in academic circles for years. Then, Barron Trump leaned forward. Until that moment, he had been listening intently, showing no sign of urgency. But when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and controlled. "So, you're saying free speech should only apply when it aligns with certain perspectives?" he asked. The liberal student, caught off guard, quickly responded, "No, I'm saying hate speech shouldn't be tolerated." Barron nodded. "Define hate speech," he said simply. The student hesitated for a moment before offering a broad definition that included offensive language, misinformation, and any rhetoric that could make marginalized groups feel unsafe. That's when Barron delivered his first blow. "So, if one group feels threatened by an opinion, that opinion should be silenced?" The student stammered. "Not silenced, just not given a platform." Barron's expression didn't change. "But isn't denying a platform a form of silencing? Who decides what speech is too dangerous to hear? The government? Big tech? A panel of experts? History has shown that when you give any group the power to determine what people can and cannot say, it never ends well." A murmur spread through the room. The student attempted to push back, arguing that some voices hold disproportionate power and that restrictions help level the playing field. But Barron was ready. "You mean like major media outlets, corporations, and social media platforms that openly suppress certain viewpoints while amplifying others? If controlling speech was really about fairness, then why do we only see one side being silenced?" At this point, the room was silent, everyone leaning in. The liberal student tried again. "But words have consequences. Harmful rhetoric can lead to real-world violence." Barron nodded again. "So can censorship. When people feel they can't express their frustrations or challenge ideas, they don't stop thinking those things. They just stop saying them publicly. And when discussion is shut down, those frustrations fester and sometimes explode in ways that are far worse than if they had been debated openly." The student exhaled sharply, searching for a response. He then shifted his argument, claiming that free speech wasn't absolute, using the classic example of shouting fire in a crowded theater. Barron was unfazed. "That analogy has been misused for years," he said. "The original ruling that introduced it was overturned because it was used to justify restricting anti-war speech. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire, because it's intentionally deceptive and causes immediate harm. That's not the same as expressing an unpopular opinion." The student's confidence wavered. The audience could see it. Some of his supporters, who had been nodding along moments earlier, were now shifting in their seats. Barron pressed on. "If someone disagrees with me, I want to hear their argument, not silence them. If their ideas are bad, they will collapse, under scrutiny. If they're right, then I learn something. But shutting people down only makes them more determined, and it forces ideas underground where they grow unchecked." As Barron Trump made his way toward the exit, the liberal student sat frozen in his seat, eyes darting around as if searching for a lifeline. A few of his peers whispered amongst themselves, trying to salvage the argument, but the damage had been done. The clarity and precision with which Barron dismantled each point left little room for rebuttal. Then, one student, clearly frustrated, blurted out, "That's easy for you to say. You're a Trump. You've never had to worry about oppression or discrimination." Barron stopped. He turned back, his expression still calm, but now with a hint of curiosity. Are you saying my argument is invalid because of who I am and not because of what I said? The student hesitated, then doubled down. Privilege matters. You have power, money, connections. You don't understand the struggles of marginalized communities. Barron nodded, acknowledging the sentiment. I agree that privilege exists. But if my privilege automatically makes my argument invalid, does that mean someone with less privilege automatically has a valid argument? Silence. Barron continued. If we're going to judge arguments based on identity rather than logic, then we're saying truth is subjective. And if truth is subjective, then why should anyone listen to you either? More whispers. A few gasps, some heads nodding in reluctant agreement. Barron wasn't just debating, he was exposing the contradictions within their ideology, and he was doing it without hostility or condescension. The liberal student, still determined to regain control, tried another angle. Well, even if you're right about free speech, don't you think that some ideas are too dangerous to spread? Shouldn't we have limits? Barron took a step closer. What's more dangerous, allowing bad ideas to be heard and refuted, or pretending they don't exist and letting them fester in secret? The student exhaled sharply, shaking his head. It's not that simple. Barron smiled slightly. It never is. But making speech restrictions based on what makes people uncomfortable? That's a dangerous precedent. Today it's one opinion being silenced. Tomorrow, it could be yours. That last sentence hit hard. A few of the liberal student supporters exchanged uneasy glances. They had spent years advocating for speech restrictions, confident they would always be on the right side of history. But what if the power to censor ended up in the hands of someone they disagreed with? One girl, who had been nodding along with the liberal student earlier, suddenly spoke up. So, you're saying free speech is about protecting everyone, not just the people we agree with? Barron turned to her. Exactly. The girl sat back, deep in thought. Meanwhile, the liberal student had nothing left. His confidence had evaporated. The momentum had shifted entirely. The moderator, realizing there was no real counterpoint left, cleared his throat and attempted to move the discussion forward. Well, that was an engaging debate. Let's take a moment to reflect before moving on to our next topic. But the energy in the room had changed. People weren't just listening, they were questioning. Barron had done more than win a debate. He had planted seeds of doubt in a space where ideological certainty had reigned for years. As Barron finally exited the room, a group of students whispered among themselves. One leaned in and said, I don't even like Trump, but damn, that was solid. Another replied, yeah, I wasn't expecting that. And in that moment, it became clear. Barron Trump hadn't just silenced his opponent. He had challenged an entire way of thinking. And whether people liked it or not, they would be thinking about that debate for a long time. As Barron Trump walked down the hallway, the debate still echoed in the minds of everyone in the room. Some students sat quietly, replaying his words, while others murmured among themselves, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The liberal student, still at his seat, stared blankly at the table in front of him. He had walked into that debate expecting an easy victory, backed by a room full of like-minded peers. Instead, he had faced a challenger who didn't just disagree, he dismantled his entire argument with logic and precision. One of the student's friends leaned over and whispered, Dude, you should have hit him with the systemic oppression angle. But the liberal student just shook his head. It wouldn't have worked. He was ready for everything. Meanwhile, outside the debate hall, Barron casually checked his phone, unaffected by the moment that had just unfolded. To him, this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about something much bigger. The importance of standing up for free speech, for open dialogue, for the ability to challenge ideas without fear of being silenced. Then, from behind him, a voice called out, Hey, Barron! He turned around to see the girl from earlier, the one who had asked if free speech was about protecting everyone, not just the people she agreed with. She jogged up to him, slightly out of breath. I just wanted to say, I never really thought about it that way before, she admitted. I always saw free speech debates as a left versus right thing, but the way you explained it, it's not about sides, is it? Barron gave a small nod. No, it's not. It's about principles, and principles have to apply to everyone or they mean nothing. She hesitated, then smiled slightly. Well, thanks. You gave me a lot to think about. With that, she turned and walked away. Barron watched her go, knowing that at least one person had left that debate seeing things differently than before. Back inside, the room slowly started to clear out. But even as students gathered their things and left, the atmosphere had changed. The usual sense of certainty, of knowing exactly where everyone stood on every issue, was gone. Barron had done something rare. He had forced them to think. And in a world where so many debates devolved into shouting matches, where people clung to their beliefs without question, that was the most powerful thing of all. As Barron Trump disappeared into the halls of the school, one thing was clear. This wasn't just another debate. It was a moment, one that would be remembered for a long time. As Barron Trump continued down the hallway, the weight of the debate lingered in the air behind him. Students who had once dismissed him as just the quiet Trump now saw him in a different light. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't resorted to personal attacks, and yet he had controlled the entire room with nothing but logic and an unwavering confidence in his principles. Meanwhile, inside the debate hall, the liberal student finally stood up, his face still flushed with frustration. A few of his supporters gathered around him, offering reassurances. That was just optics, one of them said. He made it sound good, but that doesn't mean he was right. Yeah, another agreed. People will forget about this by tomorrow. But deep down, the student knew that wasn't true. He had felt it in the room, the silence, the hesitation, the shift in the energy when Barron had asked questions no one had expected. Some of his own friends, the people who had always backed him up in debates, had been left speechless, and that was what stung the most. As he grabbed his backpack and turned to leave, he caught sight of a group of students in the corner, still discussing the debate. One of them, a guy who usually sided with him on every issue, was shaking his head. I don't know, man. He made some good points. If we start deciding who can and can't speak, where does it end? The liberal student clenched his jaw and walked out. Elsewhere on campus, the debate had already spread beyond the room. Students were texting about it. Some were defending Barron's argument, while others were scrambling to find ways to refute it. One student, a self-proclaimed activist, took to social media to vent. People need to stop acting like Barron Trump owned that debate. He just used rhetorical tricks to make censorship sound bad. We still need protections against harmful speech. Don't be fooled. But even in the replies, the cracks were showing. He wasn't using tricks. He was making sense. So who decides what's harmful? That was literally his point. If your argument is solid, why are you afraid of people hearing the other side? It was happening. People were questioning things they had never questioned before. Back at home that evening, Barron barely gave the debate a second thought. He had done what he always did, spoken his mind, defended his beliefs, and let the arguments stand on their own merit. While the rest of the school was still buzzing about it, he had already moved on. But others hadn't. The next morning, as he walked through the halls, he noticed something different. People who had never spoken to him before gave him curious glances. A few nodded in quiet respect. Others avoided eye contact altogether, unwilling to acknowledge the impact of what had happened. Then a student he barely knew approached him. He was one of the more outspoken figures on campus, someone who had always been on the other side of political debates. Hey, he said, falling into step beside Barron. That was interesting yesterday. Barron raised an eyebrow. Interesting. The student smirked. Look, I don't agree with everything you said. But I can't lie. That was probably the best debate I've seen here. You actually made me think. Barron simply nodded. That's the point. And with that, he kept walking. Because at the end of the day, Barron Trump didn't need to win debates. He didn't need applause or viral clips. All he needed was to make people think. And that, more than anything, was what left the entire school stunned.